Not far from the edge of our village, there is a well. The opening has been boarded up to keep children like me from understanding the truth. This well had been an important source of water, one of the 4 main wells that the village's 500-ish residents relied on for almost as many years. But keeping us from the truth, or keeping the truth away from us, was more important than keeping every water supply open. The water would have been unfit to drink at this point anyway. I heard my father's friends grumble to each other. I knew the truth, of course. When one child of the village knew, the rest would too. And we had been partial witnesses the day of its condemnation. The last day the well had still been open and inviting. The truth is that my brother had been a hero at that well. They should have put up a statue of him or something, to his honour. But nobody would go near it after he had gone down and never come back up. They boarded up the well and performed cleansing, protective rituals over it. This was 4 years ago. A little girl had fallen into the well one careless afternoon in July, when the rest of us had been playing nearby. She had tugged at the rope trying to get a drink of water, and it had given in, reeling in after her, bucket and all. So, we had no way of pulling her out. Now I think of it, she might have been playing tug of war at the time, without knowing it, and lost. A few of us ran to get help, but we knew it would be just a little too late if someone didn't act now to save the girl. We could hear her echoing calls from the bottom, alive and miraculously unhurt, but fighting to stay afloat, on the verge of drowning. The water level was so low we couldn't see anything that far down. We knew she was suspended in utter darkness, in the cold of the underworld, where not even the heat of the sun could reach. She had survived till now, but we had given her up for dead. Not my brother. My brother, 14 and fearless, had made up his mind. He had gone in after her. He lowered himself down the well, inch by inch, setting his feet flat against one side of the wall and his back pushed up against the other. His arms outstretched on either side as he walked himself farther and farther down. Slowly, he let himself deeper into the well until the light of the fading day could not touch him and he was lost from our view. All the way down, he called to the girl, coaching her on how to stay afloat until he could get to her. Her splashing grew less frantic, more purposeful, as she heard him and calmed down. My brother was a born leader. All the kids trusted him, even though we all knew he wouldn't be able to climb back out with her until help arrived. It was a great comfort just to have him waiting alongside you in the depths of nothingness, speaking courage where you had none. "I got you," I heard my brother say somewhere in the dark. Before long, "I've got you. Just hold on to me. They'll come for us soon. I promise." And they did come. The village firemen trundled in with their proud new floodlight, precariously attached to their jalopy of a fire engine, followed by a crowd of people. adults and more children. They threw themselves importantly into the scene. This wasn't the first time someone had fallen into one of the village wells. It was an easy shot to glory for them. We children were jostled out of the way to give them room to act. I wanted to stay and watch my brother emerge the hero he was. I could still hear him and the girl calling up to the firemen to let them know they were down there. They were alive. Please hurry, they said. They should have hurried. Instead of putting on a show, keeping people back, the same people they had brought as witnesses, they should have hurried. The scene was getting crowded. I was getting faint from the heat of the sun and the intensity of the situation. Having never witnessed a village well rescue myself. But I was famous at home for my inconveniently timed sun fevers, as my father called them, and my weak heart. I was actually lucky to be alive. The doctors had told my parents at birth. Told them my brother was lucky to have a younger brother to play with. My mother, who was also present at the scene, sensed my worsening condition and had sent my nurse to drag me home to wait for them and my brother to return. I was already growing bleary with unease, upset at myself for not being able to stay. Finally, I'd given in, just as the firemen had dismantled the floodlight to bring it over to the side of the well, preparing to go in. They hadn't yet lowered a rope. I remember being carried back home half asleep over my uncle's shoulder, my nurse walking close by. My parents had both stayed behind at the well. I remember hearing the firemen shouting, people screaming, the fire engine creaking violently with the hurried action. The rescue was well underway, though much noisier than I thought it would be. We were far enough away, down the dusty path, that only the far-flung echoes reached us. Finally, I fell asleep. When I woke up at home, on the outdoor cot in our shaded veranda, it was getting on to evening. The balmy air gave way to a chill, and the mosquitoes were dotted on the net over my head, like the clingy vestiges of a nightmare. My nurse was sitting on the steps beside me, eavesdropping on the conversation going on inside from the open back door. I shot up and ran around her before she knew I was awake. I flew into the house, looking for my brother. I found my mother instead, crying at the table. My father was on his feet beside her, hands on his hips. He could never sit down when he was upset. His eyes were red, as if he had also been crying. I'd never seen him cry. Around the table, there was a fireman or two, a village constable. The village priest sat near, comforting my mother. The village head had come and gone. I did not see my brother. Nobody would talk to me. The discussion had died the moment I barged into the room. My mother wanted to hold me, but hearing her crying into my hair woke up a deep fear in me. And since nobody would answer my shouted questions about my brother, I fled the house, leaving my parents' pleading calls behind me like footprints. I wanted to run back to the well, certain he would be there, but I was stopped on the way by people coming back the other way, haggard, drawn, ill-looking. I recognised one of my friends returning with his own family. It seemed the whole village had made the trip to the well. The later ones were being turned back before they could get there. From what I heard, they had the village holy men praying over the well as the firemen hurriedly boarded up the opening. The rest were told to go home and pray. There would be a general meeting either later that night or early the next morning to discuss what to do moving forward. There was nothing else they could do. We had never seen a village well rescue turn out like this. The drama had always been straightforward. They got the child, or they didn't. The follow-up hardly needed more than a celebration or a period of mourning. But now, they needed a plan. They needed protection. My head felt fuzzy with confusion. And my brother? I asked my friend as we walked back to the heart of the village. He glanced up at his parents, who were talking to each other in hushed tones, perhaps just as thrown off as we were. Seeing they were distracted, my friend whispered to me, "He wasn't there. They shone the light down the well, but he wasn't there." "But we saw him go down, and we heard them calling," I said, fighting down the cold panic in my chest. "The firemen were already at the well when we heard them calling." "Yes," my friend said, but hesitated before saying more. He couldn't understand it either. His face was ashen in the dimness of evening. "They put the light down and he wasn't there, and neither was Lena," the girl. "But I heard them say something was there. Something else, in the water." They'd been sent away before anyone knew for sure. I didn't know what was worse, knowing or not knowing. His parents had taken notice of us, and they pushed us into the middle of the walking party, like elephants would do with their young, keeping us in the middle of the herd for protection. The whole family had circled around us as we went down the dusty path. I could sense their concern over my well-being, though they hardly said a word, perhaps not knowing what to say. We didn't talk after that. The crowd around us had grown a little, and it occurred to me that, with their respectful silence and their lanterns swinging gently in the night, we looked like a funeral march. They were grieving with me. They didn't know what had killed my brother, but they knew he was dead. If he hadn't been at the time, he was now. Rumour had it that the girl had died the moment she had hit the water. She couldn't have been calling out. What my brother had descended into was something else waiting for him. The people of my village believe in absolutes. He is dead, or he isn't. She was alive, or she wasn't. The children were in the well, or they weren't. There can be no in-between, no shades between black and white, life and death. No matter what we children had insisted that we alone had witnessed. The elders decided to call a meeting at dawn, early enough that they knew the children would be asleep. I heard about it after. Rumour is the unofficial village messenger, and the most efficient one we have. An hour after the meeting had ended, my family was fully aware, as every other family in the village, that we were not to go near that well. There would be the usual funeral rites for each child lost that day. Empty caskets, eulogies that tiptoed around the circumstances of their death. But unless we wanted to lose any more, there would be no tampering with the barriers to the well. Whatever was down there would stay down there. As for what they had seen, no two firemen gave exactly the same description. What they agreed on was that there had been a creature in the dark water, but no children. Any survivors would have been swiftly dealt with, they said, before they could have done anything. The priests were undivided, more certain about what they believed they saw. Evil. Pure evil. The beam of light that they'd thrown into the void had brought up slivers of the truth. A greyish, mottled skin, like ancient flesh, stretched over long limbs, unblinking fish-like eyes. And there was a smile of some sort on what you might call a face. A hideous, elongated, animalistic smile. A grimace of flashing teeth. Human-like, but not. They had yanked the light back, afraid to see any more of it. And yet, they could hear the children still calling, even as they did so. The firemen swore that they had heard them, both of them, calling out to them to please hurry. They threw the flood of light down before the last echoes had even died out. All they saw was that waiting smile and the flat, dark eyes, half emerging from the murky water, waiting. Do you believe in mermaids? In our village, sliced by a river, but so far from any lake or ocean, we have a different law, a different name for these creatures. I hate to say the word out loud, even in writing. We had not expected them to turn up in wells, but since these creatures are rumoured to live in cave pools, it stood to reason that they might have travelled through underground reservoirs, found themselves under our village, using our wells as occasional feeding holes. Could they imitate human voices? Who knew? We only know what we heard. Rumour is also our messenger between villages. Ours was not the only one visited from the underground. We were lucky, said the elders of one of the neighbouring settlements. We had only had one well infested, only 2 children missing. We didn't have to draw water from our remaining wells that came up cloudy, darkened, smelling of rust. We hadn't had to board up all our wells, like other settlements had, and flee the village en masse, leaving only ghosts behind. We didn't have the things climbing out of the wells without warning. When that happened, it was over. Rather than believe what we heard, some of our villagers insisted that the firemen were lying, that they had found the children dead, drowned, too late and used this story to pretend it wasn't their fault. I didn't think so. Our claims were all in dispute, but we agreed on ground rules. Nobody strayed by the open wells too long, and nobody went to draw water alone. The protection of daylight and warnings to the full moon didn't matter. They came out when they were hungry. Time and the absence of further incidents cast the whole event in the vivid blurriness of legend. A nightmare, a bad memory, nothing more. Nothing so far had turned up in the other wells, and slowly but surely, life crept back to its normal rhythms, if not its usual innocence. Still, the other villages remained empty. Nobody came back. We're just waiting our turn. Just waiting for a reason. Now that I'm older, I sometimes find myself wandering close by that condemned well, the one my brother had climbed into, stopping by the hidden opening in broad daylight. Always in broad daylight. The worn wooden boards were more recently upgraded to corrugated metal sheets. They held fast, with bolts the size of my fist. I would stand there, lingering and remembering. If the sun is high and my fever returns, I sometimes imagine I hear something tapping at the covering from the other side, asking in my brother's voice and with a smile to let it out. My friend Marco said he made it up. That he got the idea from a horror movie where they played hide and clap. And when we were all racking our brains for a party game on New Year's Eve, Marco had been the first to make a suggestion. That sly smile of his that girls liked so much, crinkling his eyes as he told us the rules. The game requires at least 3 people, though 4 or more is better. One person is picked to be the questioner, basically the game's version of It, or the monster. Everyone else is a whisperer. All of the lights are turned off in the house, and every whisperer goes and hides, while the questioner sits in the dark counting to 60. After that, the questioner gets up and begins hunting. They're blind just like the rest, but they have the advantage of asking questions. Any other than those directly identifying the name of the whisperer or their brethren. Feeling their way through the dark, they can call out questions. The whisperers must answer, though they may answer softly, as their name implies. It was at this point that Ryan raised his hand with a smirk. What was stopping someone from just not answering or mouthing the words? Marco hadn't returned his smile. Instead, looking over all 5 of us with a seriousness that wasn't like him. That person would have broken the rules of the game and would be punished accordingly. This prompted some laughter from us, but I could already hear the nervous excitement I was feeling echoed in my friends' voices as well. Marco seemed to not notice as he went on. The questions and whispered responses served 2 purposes. The first was a means of locating the whisperers. When someone was found, they became a questioner too. If, however, a questioner figured out who was their prey before touching them, they could call out the whisperer's name and then grab them, turning them into a sacrifice and putting them out of the game. This continued until everyone had been turned or sacrificed to the dark. When Marco was done, Brittany immediately began turning off lights, while Sarah and Jessie started snickering as they headed off to get another drink before we started playing. Marco glanced at me before turning to look at Ryan. "Want to be the questioner?" Ryan frowned. "Not really, man. This all sounds lame as shit. No offense." Marco laughed. "I don't know, man. No offense, but it sounds to me like you were just pussy scared of the dark." Ryan's face was already darkening when I stood up and walked between them. No, I'll do this question thing." Marco met my eyes. "Become the questioner." "Yeah, that. I'll do that." Darkness is so subjective. When all the lights were off and I was first blind and alone, I felt uncomfortable, vulnerable. But then I heard a nervous titter of laughter from another room, and I remembered that they were hiding from me. Grinning to myself, I stepped forward carefully and asked my first question. "Do you have short hair?" I heard a faint "yes" from somewhere in the dark, followed by a softer "no" from farther away. Maybe up the stairs, in the hall I thought I was entering. I froze for a second, but hearing nothing else, I went on to something more specific. "Did your senior prom date puke on you?" I heard a short yelp of laughter from upstairs, followed by 3 faint "no" whispers. 2 from upstairs and 1 from the back of the house. But I was waiting for someone else. "Yes." I stepped forward and turned to my left, barely remembering to shout out, "Brittany," before lunging forward and poking her in the stomach. Grunting, she swatted me away. "Yay, I'm sacrificed or whatever. I'm going outside to smoke." She let out a curse as she bumped into a chair, and then made her way to and out the front door. I let the echo of the closed door trail off before I asked my next question. "Are you going to pre-med?" Upstairs, faintly, "No." "Yes." And then downstairs in the back, a single "No." I was beginning to wonder about that. There were 6 of us, and yet the most I'd ever heard was 4 whispers. Sarah was pre-med, so she was upstairs. Was one of the others too far away or quiet for me to hear? Or were they just not saying anything? Frowning, I edged along the wall until my foot hit the bottom of the stairs. I wasn't as familiar with Jessie's house upstairs, but at least I knew Sarah was up there somewhere. And oddly enough, I was feeling a strong urge to win, whatever that meant. My hand found the banister as I started making my way up the stairs. I could wait till I got to the top, but maybe if I asked my next question on the way up, I could pinpoint Sarah and keep her from trying to slip by. I wasn't sure what to ask next, So I finally just said the next thing that came to me. "What do you want to do after this?" "Drink. Watch a movie." Both upstairs. And I recognised Sarah's voice coming from the right. "Watch them all die screaming." I let out a yell as I pitched forward on the stairs, barely catching myself as I rolled over onto my back. That had come from right behind me, nestled in a breath that was hot and rotten as it coiled around my neck. Who was that? Suddenly, a light came on upstairs. There was no one on the stairs with me. No one around that I could see at all. Looking behind me, I saw Jesse and Sarah coming down the stairs, worried looks on their faces. Sarah crouched down on the step above me. "Are you okay? Did you fall?" I shook my head. "No, I mean, yeah, but that wasn't why I yelled." I gave a slight shudder as I looked back down the stairs into the dark of the front hall. Someone was right behind me, whispering in my ear. It freaked me out. It must have been that fucker Marco. Ryan had suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs too, his face already growing red. And that shithead has been weird all night. I don't know if he got into some bad weed on his little camping trip or what, but I'm about ready to pound his fucking... He trailed off as he saw me shaking my head. "What? You saying it's not him?" I shrugged weakly as I stood up. I don't know. It didn't sound like him. It didn't feel like him. Like any of us. Ryan rolled his eyes. "You could have gotten hurt, okay? Let's just find him and find out what the hell he was thinking." Nodding, I took Sarah's hand and went back down, hitting the lights at the bottom of the stairs. We started calling out for Marco, and after a minute, Brittany came back in with a questioning look. We told her what had happened. Her momentary look of satisfaction that I'd fallen was replaced with concern when she saw how upset I was and how angry Ryan was becoming the longer we looked for Marco. 15 minutes later, and we had searched the whole house and yard for him twice with no luck. Calls to his phone went straight to a full mailbox, and texts got no response either. We were sitting back down in the living room when Jessie gave a small laugh. "Happy New Year, I guess. It's 12:03. We all laughed with her, but the sound was brittle. Everyone was unhappy and on edge, and I started to feel guilty about spoiling the party for everyone. Look, I'm sure it's fine. He probably just left as a practical joke. And it worked, because it freaked me out." I shrugged. Him not answering his phone is a bit weird, but who knows? Maybe it's part of the prank. I looked at Jesse. "Did you call him about the party? Or did he call you?" She frowned. "Neither. I was out jogging yesterday. When I came back, he was sitting on the steps outside. We hung out for a minute. I asked him about his camping trip after Christmas. I told him about the party tonight." Ryan leaned in. "Did he seem okay to you then?" Jesse shrugged. "I mean, I guess. We only talked for a couple of minutes, and I was tired. I wasn't looking for anything, you know?" He nodded. "Yeah, who knows? Him and his weird bullshit game." Smirking, he went on. "That's why I didn't even play it." Ryan blushed slightly. "Sorry. Wasn't trying to be a dick to you. But I wasn't playing by his stupid rules either. just sat upstairs in the bathroom the whole time, quiet as a church mouse. The next day, I got a call that Brittany had died from smoke inhalation. Apparently, the apartment below hers had an electrical fire that pushed smoke up into her bedroom while she slept. They claimed she never woke up, though I wondered how they knew. Wondered if she'd only had a few moments of panicked clarity before she choked to death on grey air. I didn't have to wonder about Ryan. He was working a last weekend shift at his father's steel mill before heading back to class. He'd done it every summer and holiday since he was 17. But that night, the night after the party, there was a misroll on one of the hot rolling mills. 30 feet of red, molten steel shot out like a spray of burning silly string, hitting the wall and two of the men. It only burned the other man's leg. But Ryan? When he was drunk enough at the wake, Ryan's dad told me and Sarah that it had coiled around his boy like a python, burning and crushing him down as it tightened, cooling from the air on the outside, and the blood and the meat within. He'd been on the floor, less than 50 feet away, and the last memory he had of his only child was watching helpless as he died screaming. No one has seen or heard from Marco in the last 2 weeks. He still doesn't answer his phone or his door. No one we asked knows where he is. Last night, I finally tracked down a number for his mother. She lives in Chicago, and we'd never spoken. But I figured it was worth a try to see if she'd heard from him. Hello? Hey, Mrs. Sandoval? I'm a friend of your son, Marco. Oh, that's... Have you heard from him? I gripped the phone tighter. No, that's what I was going to ask you. We've been looking for him. When did you last hear from him? There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, the woman's voice seemed thinner and more lifeless than before. It was the day after Christmas. He left to go camping, always rushing off to do something. But he was supposed to be back in 2 days. When he didn't come back in 3, I called the park service. They had a record of him camping there, even found where he'd stayed, but no Marco. Not there or anywhere. No one's seen him since. Another pause, and when she spoke again, a new worm of hope was buried in her words. When did you last see him? Have you seen him since he went camping? I slumped down to the floor, barely hearing my last words to her over the hammering of my heart. No, I don't think I have. Some time ago, I can't remember when exactly this happened, but it must have been at least a few years. Me and a group of friends found the name of an old song printed into a very tall wall. It was called 300 Feet. Curious, we wanted to hear it. How can you not be curious about such an ominous thing written on some random wall? So, we began looking, trying to find any trace of this song. But no matter how long we searched, or who we asked, we couldn't find it anywhere. People even started giving us weird looks, treating us like we were mad or like we had phantom memories of this song, or as if we were making it up or just trying to annoy them. Honestly, I was the one starting to get annoyed. Eventually, thanks to sheer luck, our search came to an end as we came across an old man who said that he knew what the song sounded like. He was so old, messy, long and grey hair, disheveled, dirty clothes with holes in them, stained with whatever fluids had gotten on them over the years. His eyes were blurred and a bit unsettling, but his voice was calm and gentle. Despite his unkempt and shady appearance, he was very friendly and well-mannered. We asked to hear the song, but he said you could only hear the song at 300 feet up the wall that we found its name written on. The others backed down, skeptical of such an unusual requirement just to listen to a song, except for one of them that still wanted to hear it. That person was me. After being left behind by my friends and expressing my persistent desire to hear the mysterious song, the man agreed to take me up there. We climbed for a mere minutes, but it felt like hours. The most workout that my legs had gotten in years. I could even feel them burn and shake. But my weight paid off as we got to the top. It was very windy and chilly, but kind of relaxing. Despite that, I was confused as to how I still couldn't hear the song, despite the man's words. Once the man got me up to 300 feet, he leaned in and pushed me off the wall. Naturally, I began screaming in terror. The man followed, jumping, as well as dying from the fall, in a splattered mess of bone shards, flesh, and brain matter. In that moment, I found that my scream sounded so beautiful, so elegant. While dreadful and horrifying, it was a desperate melody, played by an orchestra as it reached its climax, played by a group of angels wielding the finest of instruments, and sung by the highest of seraphim, with throat-scraping notes that left their vocal cords dry and burnt. I wanted to hear it again. God, I felt like I couldn't live without it. But despite my strongest attempts and wishes, and to my own disappointment, I could not replicate even a single note. So instead, I called my friends, overjoyed by the sweet melody I'd listened to, and eager to share it with the world. Hey guys, do you still want to hear the song? My friend Sam had been given a lie detector as a gift for his birthday. He described it as a small little box with a speaker and small red lights that sat in the middle. He told me that it could detect surroundings and use Google Maps as a way of knowing. He also said that a loud noise signals a lie. We both thought it seemed pretty legit, so we called each other on our phones. We began speaking into the lie detector to see if it really was real. Sam started saying, "I hate my dog." The lie detector went off with a high-pitched noise. "I'm afraid of the dark," I said. The lie detector went off once more. After a few minutes, Sam grew bored. He began asking more serious questions. "I have killed someone," he said. The red light beeped. "I'm hiding a body." The red light went off again. Sam laughed. I thought it was funny too. "There's a murderer in my house." Silence. Sam froze. The first thing he fed it was fear. He met it in the trees behind his house, a place he liked to hide. At first, he didn't realize it was there. Gradually, it came into focus. Its features were hard to make out. They seemed to continuously morph. Sometimes it was serpentine, wolf-like, or winged. It spoke to him in a language he'd never heard before, though he could understand the words. "Why do you fear me, human?" Mark stumbled backward, held by its yellow gaze. The beast rose from the shadows and moved closer. "You fear me, yet you are much more afraid of returning home to your father." Mark was too shocked to speak. The beast bared its sharp teeth at him. "Feed me your fear, human. I will take your burden from you." Mark felt himself letting go. His body gradually relaxed. The beast finally addressed him again. "Go home now. Your fear is safe with me." The next time he saw the beast, he fed it his sadness. This time, it visited him in his room. Mark cowered under the covers as it rose up from beneath his bed. "Why must you covet your pain so? Release it unto me." The beast's yellow glare grew wide. The tears that had been forming in Mark's eyes dried. The weight on his shoulders was lifted. He slept soundly that night. The beast sat at the foot of his bed, singing wordless lullabies. The years went by, and Mark was nearing adulthood. Whenever he was sad or afraid, the beast was there to remove his burden. Eventually, though, it wasn't enough. The rage inside him would come spilling out. When the beast saw this, it became ravenous. "Human, release your anger to me. Rid yourself of this poison." Mark fed it all that he had. The beast had freed him, in a way. He was never afraid, sad, or scared. Yet his physical being was still being harmed. He would look at his wounds in the mirror, indifferent to them. The beast had consumed nearly everything Mark felt. Yet, it came to him again. "Human, feed me your love." For the first time, Mark was hesitant, but the beast persisted. "Your love is keeping you a prisoner." Mark thought for a moment, and then he fed the beast again. After he buried his father in the forest, the guilt Mark felt was overbearing. He fell to his knees and pleaded, "Please, take the guilt, take it," he begged. The beast stood silently for a while. "It is the only thing left that makes you human." Mark pleaded, take it, please." It obliged, consuming the last piece of Mark's soul. Then, it was gone. Mark shakily got to his feet. He was numb, a ghost of himself, soulless. He found himself in front of a mirror. A pair of eyes stared back at him, his ghastly features shifting constantly. "Please, it's coming. I know it is. Help!" I was leaning over my clipboard, mouth set in a hard line, trying my damned hardest to shut out the screams. They were muffled, but only so much. I shook my head in frustration. Man, he's been at it for hours. I looked around at the source of the voice. Jeremy seemed unperturbed by the screams. I guess one gets used to them at some point. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a sandwich in the other, a condiment of some sort leaking onto his fingers. I peered through the small window of the cell at the man huddled against the wall. He was thrashing on the floor, struggling against his bonds. "Oh God, it's here! Please, please listen to me! It won't stop following me! I have nowhere to hide, please!" Jeremy took a juicy bite of his sandwich. "It's been a while since one of them screamed so much, eh?" He bumped my arm in a jovial fashion. "It's a good thing we picked this nut off the street. He was terrorising the neighbourhood." I heard a dull thumping from the room as the man threw his wrapped shoulder into the door. "How can you not see it?" He paused momentarily, eyes widening. "My God, it's hideous! Please!" I chewed on my lower lip, a chill running up my spine at the maniacal look in the man's eyes. Do you think we made a mistake?" The man was throwing his weight at the door even harder now. His screams intensified, spittle flying in drops from his mouth. "Get back! Get back!" Jeremy threw me a sharp glance. "It's just some hollering, man. It's never bothered you before." He took a sip of his coffee. "In fact, it's a good thing we immobilised him, or he'd probably hurt himself." I raised my hand to silence him. Something was wrong. The psychiatric ward was eerily quiet. I peered into the cell, trying to get a clear look at the lunatic. The man huddled himself against the wall of the padded cell, eyes bulging from his head, the veins standing out purple on his pale face. "It's here! It's here! It's here!" He was wheezing on repeat. And then he exploded in a shower of blood. Click-clack, click-clack. 2 dice tumbled onto the blood-soaked table before settling on a 1 and a 2. The thing behind Joe moved 3 spaces closer. Then his horse figurine slid 3 spaces across the cursed board game. His eyes looked ready to spill tears when he stared at me. "Your turn." Each horse seemed to sneer as I hesitated to reach for the dice. Whatever was behind me growled menacingly. Okay. My hand grabbed and rolled. 2 1s. My horse moved itself along the path as the thing behind me got 2 steps closer. "Listen," he said, sounding guilty. An angry growl cut him off, but he continued louder. "I'm sorry I made all of us come to this stupid house. I'm sorry I made us play this stupid game. I wish I never found it. I wish I never did a lot of things. I deserve to die here just like Tiff." The growling transformed into a horrid snarl that made him flinch. I spoke. "Just take your turn, Joe. It's our only way out. Tiffany tried to leave and you saw what happened." A wet crunch sounded from the darkness on the empty side of the game board. Tiffany's own creature snacked on her corpse loudly. The sound of dice hitting the wood brought back my attention. Click, clack, click, clack. This time, they displayed a 4 and a 2. Joe started whimpering as his horse slid 6 spaces. The piece now sat extremely close to the finishing line. Surely one more move and he would be safe. Yet his monster still moved closer from behind. The game was giving me a chance. I was able to put his tears out of my mind long enough to grab and re-roll the dice. Once they settled, a 5 and a 6 faced the ceiling. My miniature horse passed Joe's, putting me at the finishing line. I won. "I'm sorry, I'm out," Joe shouted. He managed to stand up, but before he could run, the beast quickly moved to attack. A shrill scream escaped his lips before 2 gnarled claws ripped through each side of his chest. Dark, scarlet blood poured from the wounds as he was dragged back into the darkness, just like Tiffany. A disgustingly familiar chewing sound started from just beyond my vision. The room sat still for a second. "You know, what you did was technically cheating." The grisly demon voice spoke from behind me. "Oh, that's okay," I assured it. Him and Tiff know all about cheaters. Besides, I had to feed everyone somehow. It first came to light, as young people usually get their news these days, through a meme. This one had a picture of a spooky-looking movie in the form of Slender Man, and was captioned, "Turn your devices off, or the Shadow Man will come." A lot of people scoffed at this, and the Shadow Man challenge started. Hundreds of teenagers stayed up all night, posting Creepypasta on their phones, watching horror movies on their televisions, and played Silent Hill and other games like that on their PCs or consoles. Supposedly, these monsters travel through the wires, through signals, to pop out of electrical entertainment. Their favourite way of transportation was through the phone. These creatures were like squids, and their tentacles would latch onto your face and suck people into their devices. Once again, supposedly to join their army of terror. I say army, but I guess I should say army with a capital A, because that's how it started, as a military experiment. Experiment X-54B, or more popularly dubbed, Project Ride the Lightning. It was started as a means of transportation for soldiers, to travel faster than the speed of normal travel through the networks, both allowing for faster mustering and infiltration. However, something went horribly wrong when trying this new technology underwater to ease deep-sea travel and communication. They found some form of life that was never meant to be found by humans, and those life forms were pissed. They infiltrated Experiment X-54B, and they took control. After the memes and challenges spread, society as we know it was on the verge of collapse. You may think I'm telling you all of this as a word of warning. You may be right. Or maybe, just maybe, I might be one of those entities, trying to keep your eyes on your device for as long as possible. Either way, keep riding the lightning. Sunny wasn't good at talking with others, but she tried. People would often mistake her honest gestures of friendship for other things. So eventually she settled on not speaking altogether. Once she became mute, she could hear people better, their whispers and their judgments. She hated them. And after a while of hearing them, she came to hate herself. "Sunny is so creepy," one person whispered, and she heard it loud and clear. She couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the day. Sunny should move away, someone thought. Sunny stared for a moment, having noticed how their lips didn't move. She felt a ball of confusion and worry forming in her throat. It all made her think of that one taunt. Sunny is a witch. She should burn a mistake already, Sunny thought. Or, well, she thought it. That was weird. She looked up for a moment and saw that she could see herself sitting in her desk. When she blinked, she was back to her own perspective again. She didn't like that she suddenly knew what people were thinking. Most of the thoughts were innocuous, which relieved her slightly. But others were downright deplorable. The only things that had lessened the weight of the things too hideous to say aloud was those few thoughts of mercy. Why are we all so mean to Sunny again? One of the merciful ones was standing in the subway with some of her friends. She thought long and hard until she could remember her name. Crystal. She seemed to not get why the school was being so cruel to her, so she hardly ever said anything. For Sunny, she was best friend material. You shouldn't keep your mouth closed, you know. One of Crystal's friends started up. Rumour has it, Jake's taken a liking to Sunny. Sure, she's pretty, but she's also a total creep. What kind of weirdo keeps her hair in her face anyway? Suddenly self-conscious, Sunny brushed her hair back behind her ear. Quiet, Mary. She might hear you. I want her to hear me. She's a total embarrassment. Betcha she pulls a carry at prom. One of Crystal's quieter friends groaned. Oh, please. Sure, she's mousy, but she couldn't be cool like her if she tried. We could totes pull the pig blood, though. The voice rang with a dull humour. Sunny didn't like it. Sunny also didn't like when Crystal said, fine, if it'll get you off my case. She has it coming anyway. Sunny's eyes bore into the back of Crystal's skull. She looked through her, past her, going further, until she could see the approaching lights of a speeding subway car. Sunny blinked when she felt the splatter of something wet from afar, and winced when she heard the screaming of the other girls. When she looked, Crystal was missing. The subway car speeding past, but screeching as it tried to stop. An old man is waiting to be called in for a regular doctor's appointment. It felt different for him. It felt cold, although it be the middle of July. He shrugged it off. Must just be old age, he thought. He noticed that in his days, the hospital had become empty. He was the only one there. He waited for a moment, with horrific theory flooding into his mind. What if he was going to be kidnapped? What if this place is haunted? He was a very logical man. Surely he was just overthinking the situation, and there would be a logical explanation for everything. He was getting old after all. And then he heard on the speakers, "Jeremy Edwards, please proceed to room 8B1. The first number is the floor number. The second number is the room number. The third number is the wing number." The voice was scratchy, yet fluent enough to be understood. The man proceeded to enter the elevator, but it only went up to floor 7. "That's odd," he thought. But the elevator doors closed and went up without the man pressing anything. The man, now shaken from the strange experience, continued to room 8B1. All of the lights in every room were off, except for room 8B1. When he entered the room, there was nothing there, except for 3 more doors on all sides of the room. When he turned back to the door, the one he came from, there was simply a wall in its place. It's always my job to walk the dog at night. My partner takes the morning and afternoon walks. She works from home, so she's the obvious choice. I'm gone until 5:30 every day, so I take the night walk. In the summer, it's the best. Warm breezes, frogs croaking by the lake. But the winter breaks me. It sucks my soul out as quickly as my heat. But the cold isn't the worst part. I wear 3 pairs of socks so I don't get too cold. No, that's not the worst part. It's the snow. I hate the snow. Snow muffles sounds, so the nights are eerily quiet. Occasionally, the moon reflects off the snow and lights the way. But most of the time, the snow glistens, only picking up the barest of light reflections from the nearby houses. And the snowmen the neighbourhood kids create form shadows and shapes that always catch the corner of my eye, startling my dog and making him bark. I'm glad I live in a cul-de-sac. The night walks are always circles. I watch the snow come, wishing I was somewhere on the beach, and walk back over the footprints I made on the way here. I try to ignore the newest snowmen. Why do they always have to be so big? Those kids must be exhausted building them all. I end up back at my house again, and look out one more time at the footprints in the snow. I know I wear boots that are too big for me. It's so I can wear a lot of socks. But I'm always surprised by how big the footprints I leave are. I know that hunting can be a bit of a controversial topic, and that some people see it as barbaric. People think that killing for sport is simply unnecessary. But I can say with certainty that going hunting can really sharpen the mind and actually give you a rush that you would hardly get doing anything else. Hunting lets you feel every moment of what you're doing. It lets you go back to your primal nature, simply you, your wits and a rifle. It makes you earn each and every moment. It forces you to have to track your prey. It forces you to think on your feet too. And if you ever get sick of hunting, you can just let it go. And you can just stop the hunt and go home. It's not like the creature will be doing anything while you're gone. It will just think it can't find you. So while you're home safe and sound, in the warm, next to your fire, the creature will be curling up somewhere, scared out of its mind at the fact that the hunter could come at any point. Besides, I know that this particular creature isn't going to go far if I'm just sitting at home. I very much doubt that John will be leaving his little girl in my care for long. I don't think she would do as well as him in my hunt. But then again, what sport is hunting a 6-year-old? I will just have to make sure I keep her locked up downstairs with the others until she grows up a bit. I heard the whispers from a young age. I did not know who was creating this horrible melody, this scary whisper, and I did not want to know. But always before I go to sleep, I hear someone whispering under my bed. But I did not have the courage to look under my bed to see who was creating the whispers. My parents didn't know about this problem, and I wanted to tell someone about the whispers. And I would say it when the tragedy came. My parents were killed one night, and I told the police about the whispers I heard under my bed. But when they looked under there, they found nothing. They caught me, and they took me to the Stevenson Psychiatric Clinic. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was crazy. 3 months have passed since I was taken to that psychiatric hospital, and I felt better. Thanks to Dr. Stan, who always took care of me and gave me the right pills. At midnight, Dr. Stan visited me in my room and smiled at me. "Thank you," he said to me. "You were the only friend I had, the only one who could hear my whispers," as he came towards me, holding a knife in his hand. It started with a desperate urge to scratch the itch deep inside his eardrum. He would try anything to satisfy it. Watching him try to get at the itch was like watching someone lose their mind. Repeated attempts had turned Mike's ear red raw, and by the time he asked me to look inside, there was already a mountain of cotton swabs, bobby pins and pencils scattered around his desk. My advice was to see a doctor, but Mike refused, stating his resentment due to past complications. Realising my protests would not get through to him, and, honestly, curious, I told him that I would look inside. At first, it was hard to identify the problem, because his previous attempts had blocked his ear with a mixture of dried blood and wax. Using a bobby pin, I scraped away the gunk, and I found a white sack lodged deep inside the canal. We tried everything to get it out, but by the end of the night, we had to stop because of the pain. Again, I told him to see a doctor. It was a simple procedure. It would save him the trouble of dealing with it himself. He told me he would sleep on it, and I left shaking my head at his stubbornness. A week passed, and I hadn't heard from him despite my messages and calls. My mother said vegetable oil could help his situation, so I decided to bring some over and check on him. When I knocked on the door, it took him longer than usual to answer. And when he did, the door only creaked open a few inches. His eyes peered at me, and I told him about the vegetable oil and my concern for his well-being. Eventually, I convinced him to open the door and let me inside. Mike looked pale. Dark bags sat under his eyes, and a trail of dried blood ran down his infected ear, giving off a smell I can't even begin to describe. I started to insist that he see a doctor, but he cut me off mid-sentence. No, it's fine. I'm a mother now. Come see, Mike said, with a smile radiating genuine joy. I followed him into the kitchen to find the bench littered with glass jars and containers. I have someone who wants to meet you guys, he called. Adam, meet Jerry, Angela, Jessica and Barry. Mike pointed to a different container with each name as the list continued. Looking inside one of the containers, a grey spider the size of my hand raised its front legs defensively, and I backed away, trying to convince myself he was just playing a prank. Don't worry, Barry. Adam's easily scared. It's nothing personal, Mike cooed. I was ready to call him out on his crap when I noticed another black spider running across his table, and I screamed. Mike only offered a heart-filled chuckle in response. Chuck's a bit of a troublemaker. He doesn't like being cooped up inside these containers. But how else do I keep them safe? As he spoke, his eyes started twitching, and two large, hairy legs began to appear from his ear. I watched as a long, black spider squeezed out and crawled across his face. How is that possible? I stammered. Oh? He said, looking up at the spider now sitting in his hair. At first it really hurt, but I made some room and now it just tickles. Turning his head sideways, I could see he had cut the cartilage of his ear to widen the hole. Unable to believe what I was seeing, I just stood there, staring, while Mike continued to smile at me. A slight tickle on the right side of my neck interrupted my thoughts, and I lowered my gaze to see a large black spider looking back at me. In a panic, I jumped and flicked the spider off my shoulder and onto the floor. "Well, Chuck!" Mike screamed, running to pick up the spider. The spiders were now clinging to the side of the jars in an effort to face me, and I physically felt the weight of 100 eyes staring back at me. "You need to leave," Mike said, with glaring eyes as Chuck limped into his hands. Trying to explain it was an accident only added fuel to Mike's anger, and he screamed at me, "Get out of my house, Adam!" Obeying his request, I left the house, but I called the police to do a welfare check. Embarrassed and sure they wouldn't believe me, I left out the fact that spiders were coming out of his ear. 2 more weeks passed, and I hadn't heard anything from the police or Mike, so I decided to make another visit. This time, Mike didn't answer, and I jumped over the fence to peer through a window that was now covered in silk. A cocooned figure was slumped over the couch, and in a panic, I broke through the window to get inside. Running over, I started to pull away the silk from his face, while pleading with Mike to respond. Unmasking the figure, I found that it was in fact Mike. Where his eyes should have been, there were spiders, gnashing their mandibles inside of his empty sockets. I shook him, hoping to see some sign of life, but he felt light, almost hollow. "Motherhood is tough," a woman's voice spoke to me. My eyes widened, and I turned in the direction of the voice to see 6 pink, flesh-covered limbs with large jet black hairs spouting out, covering half of the ceiling. They contorted down the wall and closer toward me. My body froze with fear as 6 red eyes met my own, its large mandibles dripping as it formulated another sentence. "I prefer surrogacy." I tried to run, but instead toppled over and fell out of my shoes. Confused, I looked back to find the silk had glued them to the floor. Backing away on my hands and feet, but still facing the creature, I felt something crunch under the weight of my palm. Feeling a warm liquid ooze over my hand, I pulled it up to my face to see a mixture of blue and green goo now covering it. Where my palm had been was now a crumpled up black spider, still attempting to move in my direction. A high-pitched scream came from the creature's mandibles, and its large pink abdomen wobbled as its pace quickened in pursuit. I jumped to my feet and ran for the door. The sound of glass jars smashing followed me as the creature maneuvered its body through the house. My hand slipped off the key in the deadlock, and I looked back as my heart raced. Spiders started appearing from every crevice of the house and marched behind the thing charging towards me. As the creature extended its front limbs, attempting to take hold of me, the key turned and I fell to my knees outside. Wasting no time, I sprinted away from the house, leaving my car and not bothering to look back. Nothing followed, and although the police found Mike the same way I had, they still didn't believe my story. Grieving the death of my friend was hard, but the gossip and questions made it 10 times worse. There wasn't a soul in town who believed me, and I'm sure my version of events are bound to become small-town folklore, told only in schoolyards and at sleepovers. They almost had me convinced I'd lost my mind, until I started to feel an itch inside my own ear. At first I was scared, but the feeling passed when a strange thought invaded my mind. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to be a mother. So, my brother and I, we kind of grew up on Pokemon. Round here, a lot of kids did. It worked out perfectly for us too. Every time a new gen came out, one of us would get one version, one of us would get the other. And since our mum liked to spoil us, we both got the third one. This is going to sound at first like a bittersweet story about two siblings who grew up with a couple of games that eventually take them down two different roads. Well, it's a little more than that. The years rolled by. We kept on collecting. Game Boys got old. We replaced them. Cartridges finally gave out. We picked up new copies. But we started down two completely different roads before Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald came out. See, around then, my brother got a Game Shark. We'd heard all the hacks and cheats you could do with them, even if we were kind of late to the party, and they sounded pretty cool. Our first guinea pig cartridge was my brother's old blue version. We just dicked around with it a bit, nothing major. But whatever we did, and fucked the cartridge up. After just a couple of code entries, it glitched out completely and became unplayable. Naturally, we were upset at first. My brother mourned the loss of his hours of work, and I was sympathetic. I told him, it's okay, we can replace it, I guess. Stupid Game Shark was a waste of money. But here, our paths finally differed. After seeing the mess it had turned Blue Version into, I had become opposed to the idea of hacking or cheating any of my games. What can I say? I feel feelings for the little pixel critters. At least with that Game Shark. But my brother had taken his game's destruction as a personal challenge or something. I don't think he ever played a game after that which wasn't hacked somehow. Yeah, we played a shit ton of Pokemon, man. But for us, there really wasn't much else to do. We live way out in the country, without many other kids, and the farmers didn't want us on their property. So, we played Pokemon out on the lawn, just about all day, every day. It was pretty awesome. To us, at least. We lost the Game Shark when our rooms got moved around. A new addition was built onto our house, and it disappeared in the mess of shit that got stuffed into the new closet. Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald arrived, and after playing through them once, we were both in agreement that they were definitely lacking in comparison to the last gen. We both tried another honest playthrough, and though we managed to finish, it left us both yearning for some good old-fashioned nostalgia. Where were our old gold, silver and crystal cartridges though? It took us probably a month to dig through the boxes we'd been too lazy to open up before. But we finally found one full of a shitload of all our old electronics. My old purple Game Boy Color still worked. His red one could no longer hold batteries in place. Both of our GBAs were fine though, along with our snake lights and link cables. That one with the nifty little connector in the middle that I'd always wrapped up oh so carefully to avoid fraying the wires and condemning it to the trash like our last cable. We both grabbed up everything we could. It was so nice to have yellow, which had been my first and most cherished game of any series, not just Pokemon, and red and gold back. We went through the motions of checking our old files, taking in all the old memories, and eventually, we figured the Gen 1 stuff was just too nostalgic to get rid of. I restarted Gold. He restarted Silver. Immediately, he snatched up the Game Shark out of the box and slipped it into the back of his GBA. I just shook my head at him. I remember what I said to him. That thing will kill your game, you know. He never liked me preaching to him about abusing pixels. I shut my mouth after that, but it had put him off playing with me. I guess it was just one time too many or something. I ought to know to keep my thoughts to myself, really. It was a couple of days later that it happened. I was out on the porch, Game Boy in hand, just about to go into the Elite Four, when I realised I needed a little help. My team was ill-balanced, thanks to me playing through for leisure. And at the time, I was no great trainer that could pull off gimmick runs. I knew that my brother had been 2 badges ahead of me, so I was hoping maybe he'd let me borrow a Pokemon or 2, just for this run through. Now, the thing is that I'd spent the last 24 hours at a friend's place. I'd literally come home, dumped my bag in my room, and crept out into the sun with my GBA to play. I had no idea what he'd been up to. For all I knew, he was done with the game and onto a new one, which I figured was all the better for me since he wouldn't need those Pokemon, and I'd stand a better chance of nicking a few. So I got up and went into the house. When I was crossing the living room, I noticed all of his Pokemon games lying on the floor. Some of the cartridges had been mangled, like they'd been hacked at with something sharp. Even his old blue version, long ago dead and too sentimental to throw away, was lying with the plastic cut ragged, split almost halfway up the side, completely unusable anymore, even if it would have worked. I was a little scared. This had to have happened this morning, otherwise our mum would have seen and they wouldn't be lying on the carpet. Tucking my GBA into my pocket, I crept over to his room and found the door unlocked. Somehow, that was even more concerning. I walked in and I found my brother sitting on the edge of his bed. His GBA was in pieces on the floor at his feet, smashed to bits. Next to him on the bed were a hammer and our mother's gardening scissors. His face was paler than I'd ever seen it, even whiter than the time we'd gone corning and the old guy up the street, legally blind and a raving nutcase, had come and chased us into the trees with a shotgun. It was now I also noticed the Game Shark on the ground and a silver cartridge corner poking from under his bed. Somehow, they'd been spared the wrath of the hammer. "Are you okay?" I asked. I remember the chills that ran through me. He was my little brother. Seeing him like this was horrifying. "It was awful," I remember him rasping, and the way his voice rattled made my knees weak. "Oh God, white everywhere, and then darkness." I remember running over and hugging him, and I remember his limp arm fell and brushed the Game Boy in my pocket, and his sudden scream, right in my ear, making me jump and bite my tongue by accident. He ripped the handheld from my pocket and hurled it at the far wall. I cried out at the dent the plastic system made there, running over to collect it. The screen had gone dark, and though I feared the worst, when I flicked the switch it powered up normally. I waited there in the corner, trying to pretend the GBA mattered enough not to go and run for our mum. The volume was on. The Pokemon theme started up, and he screamed again, picking up the hammer. This time, I screamed too, and ran from the room with my GBA clutched to my chest like a shield. He ended up staying in the psych ward of the hospital for 2 days. When we went to visit him, I left my GBA at home. no one could figure out what had set off this strange, manic behaviour. There was some talk that I didn't understand at the time, about some kind of disorder he may have, or may not have had. But even though Mum and I had collected and brought in all the cut-up cartridges to be looked at, Mum's idea, not mine, no one had even thought to tie it back to the game. Maybe that was my fault. I hadn't said a word about what had happened when he'd accidentally touched my Game Boy, or the blind, white terror he'd been thrown into when the music had started. On my last visit to the hospital before school on my second day, I was left alone in the room with him while Mum had some private talk with the doctor, all about precautions to take should this happen again. I sat in the chair next to the bed, where he was staring at the ceiling. Then suddenly, he sat up, making me flinch. "Hey," he told me, "go in my room when you get home." I didn't understand what he meant. And then I remembered the things we hadn't packed up and brought in. The game and the hacking tool under his bed. "Get rid of them. I don't ever want to play with them ever again." His voice was so weary and desperate. He sounded like an old man on his deathbed. My poor little brother. How could I refuse? "Promise you'll get rid of them." "Okay, I promise." I was carted off to school late, and through the whole day, I only had my promise to him in my head. I didn't know it at the time, but this would be the last time that I could ever play the big sibling role and help him out. I just had to get home and get rid of that game. But as the day went on, a sick curiosity started to go through my own head. What could possibly have happened to that game that scared him so badly? I was scared myself, but I just had to know. I had to. I got home and went right into his room, bent on uncovering whatever horror was waiting for me. Mum had since vacuumed the room, and the cartridge and Game Shark were no longer visible. I got down and crawled half under the bed, feeling timid, but holding on to the promise I made as my badge of courage. Under the bed, there was enough dust to make me cough. Enough old Legos and various other toys that I couldn't set my elbow down without it landing on something. But finally, I found both objects. They'd been shoved to the corner, on top of a notebook that looked too new to have been down here long. Unthinking, I grabbed the corner of the paper and dragged everything out with me, still wheezing from the dust, allergies and all. They looked so innocent. Simple toys and a simple, spiral-bound bunch of papers. When I set Silver version and the Game Shark on the floor, I took a closer look at the notebook. On it were scrawled at least 20 different cheat codes, but one had been scratched out with a Sharpie over where it had initially been drawn in with pen. This was confusing. He'd really tried to erase it out, The marker had been pressed to the paper so hard that ink soaked through most of the pages behind it. Almost 2/3 of the way to the cardstock back cover. But pen has a way of sticking around. I picked up the notebook and tilted it backward in the light, and the reflective surface of the Sharpie revealed the indents that had been left where he'd written it. The code was an unintelligible mess of letters and numbers, but the words next to it confused me. Easter egg. Snow on Mount Silver. I remembered what he had said when I found him. He'd been raving about white, and then black. Could he mean snow? Even though it was only August, and the temperature was still climbing to 90 degrees every day, a chill ran down my spine. Did I dare? I picked everything up and brought it to my room, laid it out on the carpet in front of me with my own GBA next to it. For a long time I just stared at it, and the longer I looked, the more maniacal Lugia's face became on the sticker. Like some kind of twisted grin. Like it was daring me to find out what had happened to my brother. I was a 14-year-old kid. Did I really want to tempt fate and risk ending up like him? I glared down at Lugia for a while longer. I had to see. I slid gold out of my GBA and stuck silver in its place. It took me almost 15 minutes to compose myself and turn it on. It started up normally. I left the sound on low, too afraid of what I might hear to keep it up the full way, and curious to turn it the whole way off. The title screen was normal too. Lugia again, but somehow menacing, despite my common sense telling me it was exactly the same picture as every other time I'd started up the game. How bad could this be? I asked myself. His notes said Easter egg. Didn't that mean that was coding already in the game? The menu came up. Still absolutely normal. His character was Blake, with a mostly filled Pokédex. But the time was odd. 99999. I knew he could not have been playing that long. I'd barely logged 50 hours on my own game, and I was at the Elite Four, and I was playing slowly. Probably the result of hacking fucking up his file, I thought. Well, whatever then. The game started up, and the first thing I noticed was the prolonged black screen. It took almost a minute for anything to change, and there was no sound at all. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up already, but it was too late to turn back. Finally, a very dim sort of map came onto the screen, but it looked static. What was going on? I squinted down and realised with a fearsome pang that it was actually the Mount Silver map. But what I thought was static was heavy falling snow. So this was where he'd last saved the game. I checked his party. A very normal team for someone who'd been using a Game Shark. Typhlosion, Feraligatr, Meganium, Pidgeot, Tyranitar, Lugia, all level 100 with modded moves. typical for him. Something about the sprites was strange, though. They seemed sullen. Their colours seemed washed out, and their expressions lacked the usual vigour they normally had. I chalked this up to missing pixels or something, also due to the hacking. The map had brightened up just a smidgen when I closed out of the start menu. Indeed, snow was somehow falling very heavily. Pixels danced across the screen so fast, it was hard to see the little sprite that was my brother's character. Something was off about him too. When I checked the information, it was the same as the Pokemon sprites. The colours were dull. In fact, now that I thought about it, he almost looked frostbitten. My stomach tightened, and I turned and tried to move back down the mountain. As I hit the bottom of the screen, words popped up, and there was finally a sound. My sprite hitting an invisible wall. I can't turn back now. That was unsettling. I went into my Pokemon and tried to use Pidgeot's fly ability. I can't fly in this. Obviously referring to the snow. Fuck this, I thought, going into his bag. There was an escape rope. I tried using it. I can't go back anymore. What was going on? Once again, I tried to walk back down the mountain. And to my horror, the words changed with every attempt. I can't run away. I can't go back down. I can never go back. This last one sent a frigid feeling through my heart. There was no way down the mountain. I had to climb. Turning the little sprite around, I moved him forward. No resistance at all, though my walking speed was oddly slow. What was truly weird was the lack of grass, of trainers, of anything at all but the white snow, which still blew across the screen and made it impossible to see. As I moved further up the mountain, his walking speed became slower and slower. The static curtain of pixels grew thicker, so that I could barely make out the features of the map. But it seemed like the only way to move was straight ahead anyway. I reached what looked like a set of stairs at the very top edge of the screen. I didn't remember this being there before. As I tried to move up, the little sprite paused. I'm cold. By now, even I was getting goosebumps. His walking speed had become painfully slow, as if somehow he was being impeded. I moved him up the staircase. More text on the screen. Meganium has died. What the fuck? I thought. Pokemon don't die in these games. I checked in my party and was frightened and confused by what I saw. Meganium's sprite had been replaced by a red X. All of my other Pokemon sported varying degrees of damage, though I hadn't battled once. I went into my bag and found a single revive and tried to use it. "It's too late," it said. What kind of Easter egg was this? There wasn't much else I could do. Trying to turn around yielded the same messages as before, so I kept moving. "Pidgeot has died." I checked again. Sure enough, there was the little red X. This time, I selected it and looked at the Pokemon itself, trying to figure out what was wrong. I wished I hadn't. The sprite was mangled. Pieces of it were missing. What was left was splotched with a sickish blue-grey colour, and its eye was a solid black pit. I flipped down to Meganium. Same deal. A leg missing, a chunk of its neck, most of its head, save for that pitch-black dead eye. Morbid curiosity urged me onward, and the path never deviated from the straight upward road I'd travelled the entire time. Along the way, every now and then, another Pokemon would die. An examination of its sprite would show it was in the same condition as the others. Until all that was left was Typhlosion. One more staircase up ahead. I climbed it, braced for whatever horror awaited me. I hit the summit. It was deserted. Red was nowhere to be found. The snow had stopped falling. In the very center of the map was something sticking out of the snow. It looked like a Pokeball. Okay, maybe all this creepy shit led up to something climactic. Some final battle, using whatever was in there. If I picked it up, maybe Red would come out of hiding. I walked over and examined it. There was a burst of static noise from my game that made me jump. What appeared on the screen was a battle animation. My trainer sprite appearing, his skin tinged blue, against another mangled Pokemon sprite. It was Celebi. In the center of that black hole that was its eye, a single red dot burned out like an ember. The thing looked rotted. I didn't even get the chance to throw out my mostly dead Typhlosion before it moved. Celebi used Perish Song. A screech came out of my GBA, and I almost dropped it as the screen went white. A part of me was relieved, thinking that my final Pokemon had been KO'd and I would be transported to a Pokemon Center. But I was wrong. My sprite reappeared in what looked like a cave. Was I now inside the mountain? I checked my trainer card and felt sick. The sprite was just as mauled as the Pokemon had been. A leg gone, a single eye remaining, pitch black. So sad looking. Tears welled up at the corner, and every colour on him was replaced by those sick shades of frosty blue and grey. Every stat on the card was reduced to 0, except for the time, which still read 99999. quickly moved back to the map. His sprite there mimicked the horror it had become on the trainer card. Pieces were missing. Everything was discoloured. I started trying to walk, and at first, I received a message. "It's so cold." There was only one direction to go, upward. I moved on, and every now and then would be stopped by a message that made my heart sink lower and lower. "Mother, it feels so cold. I can't go on." The walls, as I walked, became darker and darker until they were pitch black at the end. There was an exit there, marked only by a white outline. I had no other choice but to go through it. It opened into a chamber that was also solid white. The only way to distinguish the walls was a thin, grey line that marked them as separate from the floor. Against the far wall, there was another sprite. Red sprite, intact. I'd come this far. I had to finish this. I walked right up to him and pressed A. ... A battle started. Red sprite had none of the deformities that marred my own. The colours were the same blues and greys, but he was intact. He just looked extremely sad. His first Pokemon came out. Venusaur. It was just like my own had been, but level 0, with a speck of health. I sent out Typhlosion, who had just 6 hit points. No Pokemon made a sound when they were brought into battle. Venusaur used Struggle. There was no animation, just a single point of damage done to Typhlosion, and then the opposing sprite dropped off the screen. Venusaur has died. There was no text asking me to switch out. Instead, there was just what I took to be dialogue from Red. ... His next Pokemon was Blastoise, even more mangled than Venusaur had been. It too struggled and died. After each round, there was just that ominous ... from their trainer. Every sprite was more damaged than the last. His Espeon was barely even distinguishable as a Pokemon. I realised somewhere he was sending them out all out of order, which saved just one Pokemon for last. Pikachu came out, and it was grotesque. It too was discoloured, like it was frostbitten. It was missing an ear, half its body and tail. Its head was mostly intact, but its eyes were much larger than they should have been, and glared out at me like pitch black windows into hell. But the thing that got to me the most was the giant smile that extended almost all the way to the edges of its head. Its health was somehow at 0, or at least looked that way. My hands were shaking. I didn't get a chance to attack. Pikachu used Pain Split. Pikachu has died. Typhlosion has died. It cut back to the image of Red Sprite, and now it looked like mine. With his body so butchered, it looked like a carcass stripped of most of its meat. Except it had those same soulless, deranged eyes as Pikachu. I finally understood what happened. They were dead. They were dead. And this sub-level of the mountain was the hell they now existed in. Red finally spoke. "It's over." The screen flashed black and white for a moment. Used Destiny Bond. A horrible, hideous screeching started to issue from my GBA. The screen went white, and it shrieked at me. I threw it to the floor and pressed my back against the bed. The horrible noise continued for several long moments while the screen stayed white. And then it went black. And then there was silence. It took me a long few moments, but I eventually stood up. I took the Game Shark. I took the notebook. I took that fucking possessed game. I picked them all up and carried them to the garbage can we'd already set out in place for morning pickup. At the end of our long, winding driveway, and I threw them in. When I got back to the house, I don't know what made me do it, but I picked up yellow version and put it in my Game Boy. I think it was part of me determined to make sure I hadn't somehow been tainted as well. The music started up. The game played. I turned to my Pikachu and hit A. Its smiling face greeted me with an ear twitch and a big, pixelated smile. A pleasant, normal smile. I turned my game off and spent the next hour crying on the floor. My brother and I never did play Pokemon together again. He gave it up for good. I stuck to replaying my comforting, unhacked games. That winter, the snow fell thick. I went to the park this afternoon. I thought it was going to be a fun experience. I really did. But going out with an independent 3-year-old is, well, never a fun experience. "Go off the path," he said. So we went off the path, into the wet grass and mud. The mile-long trail surrounds a wide, open field that extends forever. It's beautiful to look at. Not so fun to actually walk in. "Come on, let's get back on the path," I said, gesturing. Of course, he turned the other direction and ran further into the field. "Hey, come back here, now!" I sprinted after him. My feet sank into the mud with a gross squelch. I could feel the water seeping into my boots, cold and damp. I heard him laugh. I finally caught up with him, panting. Grabbed him by the shoulder. "We have to go back to the path, okay? "No," he said. I sighed and looked around. We were farther out than I thought. Green grass extended in every direction, gently sloping into hills and curves. A few trees spotted the landscape. The sky above was grey. Rain drizzled down, blurring the trail that looped around us. Well, shit. This was going to be a long, muddy, messy walk. "Come on," I said, pulling him by the arm. We walked around for a few minutes. Then, he abruptly stopped, bent over, and started taking off his left shoe. No, you have to keep those on." I bent down, grabbed the shoe, shook it out for rocks and jammed it back on his foot. Sighing, I stood up. What the? The trail looked further away. No, it must be my imagination. I took his hand and we trudged forward. He made it difficult. He kept turning around, looking back over his shoulder at something. I kept my focus, as we parents are so good at doing. When everything's going to shit, we just stare straight ahead, ploughing forward. I kept my eyes locked on the blurry red dot that was our car, and looked so far away. "What's that?" he finally asked me. "We're going to the car," I replied sternly, as if I could magically transport us there with my words. "Is that a person?" He twisted his whole body around, looking at something behind us. I kept my hand locked fast in his, trudging forward. My ears were freezing. My feet were wet. I could not lose focus. "We're going to the car," I repeated, through gritted teeth. "Is that a person? In the tree?" "Come on. We're going to the car." "What's he doing?" "We're going to the..." His little hand fell away from mine. A soft thud on the grass. "Oh, buddy, I'm sorry." He'd slipped in the grass and was sitting now, staring behind us. Perhaps I'd been too mean, pulling him forward like that. He was so preoccupied with whatever he was looking at. He wasn't even looking where he was going. I gently pulled him back up. "I'm sorry, buddy. I just think we need to get to the car, now. It's cold. We forgot your hat, so your ears are going to be hurt and..." I looked up. My breath caught in my throat. There was a figure, hanging by a rope on the tree behind us, limply swaying in the wind. What the hell? Every muscle in my body froze. For a second, I was paralyzed, just staring. The figure hung limply, dark in the shadows of the branches, unmoving. It can't be real. Yeah, of course. How would a dead body just be hanging there, in daylight for the world to see? There'd been a few joggers on the trail. They would have seen it surely and called the cops. In the drizzling rain at this distance, I couldn't see any details. It was most likely some stupid prank, or a belated Halloween decoration. "What's that person doing?" My son continued staring at the figure. Don't worry. It's just some stupid joke." I took his shoulders and turned him around, grabbed his hand, marched forward without looking back. The wind whipped towards us, spraying rain in our faces. I squinted, fighting through. my toes ice cold and numb. I forced my eyes on the parking lot, focused on that little red dot in the distance. But the dot grew no closer. We walked for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. Every step we took, the path was still so far away. Finally, we stopped. I glanced around, in every direction. We were still in the middle of the field. The tree was far behind us. I could barely make out the figure hanging from its branches. But the path was still as far as it ever was. How is that possible? I glanced around hopelessly, trying to figure out which part of the path was closest, which direction to go in. But it seemed like we were in the dead center of the field. "I want to go home," my son said, wrapping his arms around me. Fear panged in my chest. I knelt to his level and hugged him. "I know. I want to go home too. We just need to walk a little longer." We continued walking. When he got too tired, I carried him in my arms. We walked for a half hour, then an hour. The trail stayed out of reach. I finally collapsed into the wet grass, giving up on all hope. Then, I saw the jogger. He was in the distance, plodding along the path slowly, wearing a bright red windbreaker. I watched his path along the gravel trail, and then I screamed, "Help! Please help us!" He was far, but definitely not far enough away to not hear someone screaming at the top of their lungs. Yet, he did not turn around. Just kept jogging along the path that never seemed to get any closer. "Help!" I screamed. "We can't get out! Please come help us!" He just kept going. It's starting to get dark now. We've been trapped here, in the middle of the park, for almost 6 hours. I'm scared and hungry. So is my son. We're huddled under a little cluster of trees, trying to stay warm. I've tried calling every emergency line from my phone, but I only get static. I'm not even sure if this post will go through, but I hope something happens soon, because I hear noises. Horrible sounds. The wind coasts through the park, but in its wake, I hear whispers and snarls among the rustling of the leaves, as if the park is coming alive. And that jogger? I'm not so sure he's just some random person, because he's still there, running the loop around us for hours, never slowing down, never stopping for a break. And he's much closer now than he was hours ago. I think he's gone off the path. I can't see him in the darkness, but I can hear him. Hear his ragged breaths. Hear his footsteps in the wet grass. Getting closer with every step. If you are reading this letter, then there's a chance I'm already dead. But anyway, this is how it all started. It began when I first moved into this town. I had to transfer because of my job. The new neighbourhood was nice, and everyone seemed pretty friendly. Everyone at my new workplace were really good people. It was a Friday night. My turn to close up shop. Seemed like a simple enough thing to do. I was about to close up when I heard some sort of jingling sound behind me. I turned around. "Oh, hello," I said. Behind me was a man standing in a brown trench coat with a white beard. "I'm sorry, sir. The shop is closed for the night. If you need something, you'll have to come back tomorrow." The man smiled at me. "That's okay, kid," he said. "I'm just here to give you this." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a huge ring full of keys. He moved each one across until he stopped on one. He pulled it off the ring and gave it to me. "I was told to give this to you by your boss. He forgot to give it to you earlier to lock up the shop. Can't lock up without the key now, can we?" The man smiled and walked away. Wow, lucky he showed up. I completely forgot about the key. So, I locked up the shop and went home. The next couple of weeks went by rather smoothly. Every Friday night, I would lock up and go home, and that would be the end of the night for me. Until this one night. I went home, and I decided I wasn't tired, so I stayed up and watched some TV. I noticed it was getting rather chilly, so I walked over to my window and closed it, then sat back down, and then it got cold again. My window was open again. "Strange," I said. Anyway, I got back up and locked the window, watched a couple of movies and went to bed. It wasn't until later I heard the creaking of my door. I got up and walked over to it. It was wide open. I could have sworn I locked that. Anyway, I closed the door, then went back to bed. Then suddenly I heard the door open again. I thought to myself, what the fuck? I just locked it. And that's when I heard that sound again. The same sound I heard the other night, the jingle of keys. I slowly pulled my covers down to peek at my bedroom door, and there that man was again. This time, holding a big axe in his hand. But he didn't do anything. At least not this night. He just stood there for, well, it felt like a lifetime. But when he walked away, the clock told me it was only 1 hour. Once he left, I rushed to the door, slammed it shut, and held my back to it so it would not open. I really hope he doesn't come back tomorrow night. The Brimstone Tavern is not your ordinary tavern. Our customers are that of another world. You know, monsters, cryptids and ghosts alike all come to the tavern for a Bloody Mary or scotch with eyeballs. Some even come to the tavern just to converse with the other patrons, although Jimmy doesn't particularly like it when they loiter around. Yeah, Jimmy's the owner of the tavern, a man of few words and a few missing limbs. He had his grace of monsters when he was just 14. He and his father went on a week hunting trip when a blizzard rolled in, trapped him in their cabin. With only a week worth of food, Jimmy's father hacked off his right arm and left leg. The old man could barely believe his luck when the search and rescue came to his aid, when a Wendigo possessed his father. It's a tale he likes to tell all of his patrons, all of whom would congratulate him on his survival and throw jokes at him every once in a while. Like any other night, I made my way into the tavern through the back door and clocked in just as Jake clocked out. We passed each other and gave a nod of acknowledgement before we parted ways. That was until Jake stopped me at the door.
Mr. Clark would be here around 11.
And with that, I walked out the back of the bar and started to serve drinks. On some occasions, some of the patrons would call ahead of time and tell of their arrival. We only do this for the sake of other patrons. You know, not all monsters, cryptids and ghosts get along. The rest of my shift was uneventful, which is good. That was until I smelled the distinct smell of swamp water and something rotten. Right on time, Mr. Clark entered the tavern. His yellow, glowing eyes moved about the faces. His green skin glistened under the light as he walked up to the bar. Sat down on the stool and hunched over the table. Mr. Clark, how's it been? I asked, as I prepared as usual. A scotch with human eyeballs. Clark grunted. His gills shifted. I handed him a wet towel to keep himself hydrated.
Another group of snooty teens stumbled into my swamp. But I took care of them.
And he flashed his sharp, yellow-stained teeth at me and slammed his drink. Tapped his glass and I prepared another one for him.
Can you believe it? Some nosy teens that want to prove they're brave enough to mess with me. Ha!
Clark barked out a laugh that made me shudder. I can't imagine what he'd done to those teens. Correction. I can imagine what he did, but I don't want to. That's the catch to this job. You get exposed to the dark and macabre deeds they do to us humans. And once they down enough alcohol that would kill any human, they'll tell you their stories with great detail. Not only that, but I have to make sure everyone is not trying to cause trouble. I watched as Clark popped an eyeball into his mouth and bit down. The eyeball popped in his mouth and some of the fluid went on my shirt sleeve. He chuckled and turned to the redhead next to him. She sipped her Bloody Mary casually and avoided trying to make any eye contact with the swamp monster next to her.
Say, have you vampires ever tried a human heart before?
He asked the vampire, who rolled her eyes and turned to him with a smile.
Why, yes, but it can be messy.
Clark laughed and asked for another scotch. I poured him his drink and went down the bar to tend to another patron, a werewolf named Tom. He sneered at the redhead but kept his mouth shut, unless he wanted to tangle with a vampire in his human form.
All vampires think they're too good,
he mumbled, as he took the pitcher of beer over to his group of friends. They were all huddled in a booth in the dark corner of the tavern. I shook my head and returned to Clark, who had now started to bug the pale and skinny old man sat next to him. The old man scarfed down his third plate of organs and ordered another plate. All the while he listened to Clark's tale of the late teens.
Their bodies are at the bottom of the swamp right now. I can't wait to get back and tear into them,
Clark stated, as he licked his now chapped lips. I handed him another wet towel and he wiped himself down before he asked for another drink. I just emptied the rest of the scotch and grabbed another bottle from the back. When I came back, it was complete chaos, as Clark and the old man fought on the floor of the tavern. I cursed under my breath and set the bottle down before I went to the front of the bar and tried to stop the fight. Hint the word tried. The two of them were covered in human organs and had large gashes on their torsos, forearms and face. Clark let out a snarl and tackled the old man to the floor. They struck each other with blow after blow before a loud bang interrupted the fight. A bullet hole, right next to their bodies. I looked behind me to find Jimmy with his shotgun in hand. Motioned for the two to stand up with the barrel of the gun and kicked him out of the tavern. I stood there stunned and afraid that I'd lose my job. Jimmy then reared on me and pulled me to the back of the tavern and sat me down. "What the hell?" he shouted as he slammed the shotgun onto his desk, sent papers flying to the floor. I went to the back to get another bottle of scotch. Clark seemed like he was in good spirits, so I thought I could leave him for a second. Didn't know a fight would break out. And Jimmy shook his head and rubbed his left temple with his left hand, his prosthetic hanging loosely by his side. "What did I tell you?" "Not to leave the bar." "And you did exactly what I told you not to do," he snapped. I looked to the ground and avoided looking into his eyes. I spent the rest of my shift in the kitchen while Stacy took care of the patrons. I also had to pay for the broken cutlery, bottles, and clean the red and blue blood off the wooden floors. Took a good minute to get all the blood out, but when I was done, my shift was already over. I clocked out and walked to my car, but I was stopped by a dark shadow that walked out from behind my car. And that was the old man from earlier. His wounds were still bleeding, but he didn't seem to care or notice as he walked around my car to stand in front of me. And his gaunt face was covered in deep scratches.
"I didn't get to finish my meal,"
he stated as he took a step closer to me. Now I took a step back.
"I'm just so hungry."
Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth and down to his chin. "Look, why don't I head back inside and get your to-go bag?" I said, as I slowly started to make my way to the back door, the old man's eyes never leaving my own. When I looked away to grab the handle, well, that was the worst mistake I could have made. Because as soon as I broke eye contact with the man, he lunged at me, tackled me to the ground. He held my arms down with a strength I didn't know he had. He licked his lips and leaned down with his mouth wide open. I could feel his hot breath on my neck. And we both heard the sound of a gun cocking. Jimmy pointed the barrel of the gun to the man's head, told him to back off. The guy lifted his hands up and got off me. He backpedaled a few feet before he stopped and cracked a smile.
"I was only teasing."
The man spoke with a sickly, sweet voice. Jimmy grunted and mentioned for the man to leave, and so he did. But not before he looked at me and smirked. "Wendigos. Never know when they'll attack," Jimmy muttered. He helped me up off the ground and patted me back. "Why don't you take tomorrow off? Jake can cover your shift." I thanked him before getting in my car and driving the hell out of there. I had to park on the shoulder of the road to cry. I was almost killed. I thought as sobs racked through my body. Wendigos are the worst customers to have. There's a cow field behind my house. I moved to the house with the cow field behind it when I was 6 and was immediately filled with a sense of wonder. My old house was on a sleepy suburban street. Nothing but houses and businesses around. Certainly nothing to explore. Now I had what seemed like hundreds of acres to run around in. My parents told me not to go out there, putting an immediate damper on my excitement. We didn't know the people who owned the land, and that they might not want kids running around the property. I obeyed, and a few years went by. Around 3 years after my family moved in, our neighbours to the right moved out, and new ones occupied the house shortly thereafter. We went over to introduce ourselves, and were greeted by a set of fraternal twin girls and their parents. They were around my age, and we became fast friends. Unlike me, the twins were anything but obedient. They had a bad case of early onset teenage rebellion, even though we were all around 10. Just like me, their parents had told them that the cow field was off limits. Unlike me, they didn't plan on obeying their parents. Days after they moved in, they expressed interest in exploring the cow field. I told them I wasn't sure, that it probably wasn't a good idea. My parents were right about the cow field, but for the wrong reasons. With parental advice disregarded, we set out to explore the mysterious pasture. The cow field was not some verdant pastoral stock image. It was hilly, with 2 creeks intersecting along one of the electric fences set up around the perimeter. One of the creeks bisected the most open area of the property. Gnarled logs lay every few hundred feet, and bushes dotted the landscape. This is where the cows spent most of their time. They grazed lazily and paid us no mind at all. A road ran along one of the fences and eventually led to a neighbourhood that could be seen from this particular area. There was a wooded section, which is the portion that bordered both the twins and my backyard. Beyond the woods was an open area that bordered the property owner's house. In this open area, equipment for cattle care was guarded by a minefield of cow patties. A circular hay container, rusty farm equipment, a dilapidated chicken coop, and a floating ball water trough all sat within 100 yards or so of the house. The most notable part of the cow field was the barn. The structure was near the other farm equipment, but was obstructed by a grove of trees, twisted and bent in what seemed to be an effort to hide it from view. Nevertheless, the rotting structure peeked over the top of its hiding place. Near the barn was the entrance we used, a chained pipe gate nestled in the corner of the cul-de-sac, next to the twins' house. The 3 of us left our houses under some pretense or another, likely to go play with a neighbour up the street, or to hike up one of the trails that snaked up the mountains that enclosed our neighbourhood. We packed unnecessary supplies for our expedition, as children tend to do when going on an adventure. Backpacks full of snacks, flashlights and plastic bags for samples of this strange and forbidden land. With our gear in order and our will unbent, we made our way to the pipe gate. We stood looking at the gate for a few minutes as we worked up the courage to climb over. I couldn't go first. Anxiety had been welling up inside me during the walk over. Excruciating bile gnawed at my insides, a byproduct of violation of my parents' trust and the need to gain the respect of my new friends. The twins characteristically went first, and I nervously followed them into the beyond. Once we'd all climbed over the gate, an intense shift in the air took us by surprise. Our childlike wonder melted away into a sobering fear. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to thicken. We looked at each other. The twins' stubborn curiosity faded away. I suddenly didn't feel lonely in my fear anymore. Despite this shift, we moved on. That day, we explored the open pasture with the creek, and to our delight, we found blackberries. Bushes full of berries speckled the open parts of the pasture. The summer had given us this gift, and with it, our fear began to fade. After eating ourselves sick and getting the lay of the land, we headed back towards our houses, determined to venture back in the next day, and the day after that. Over the rest of the summer, we made consistent trips into the cow field. The sinister air no longer tainted our exploration. We remained undetected by the owners of the cow field. Until one day when we were messing with the ball in the water trough. A woman dressed in overalls called to us from the house nearby. She seemed jovial, maternal even. She told us she didn't mind us playing in the field and to pick and eat as many blackberries as we liked. We apologised for not asking for her permission to be on the property and that we appreciated her letting us explore. She told us to be careful around the barbed wire and electric fences and to watch out for cow patties. We thanked her again and turned to go back home. But before we got far from the house, she called out again and said something I won't forget, not until the day I die. Stay away from the barn. The woman's happy demeanour had become deadly serious. A tone shift similar to the one when we entered the cow field for the first time. We'd hardly noticed the barn up until this point. Of course, we had seen it, but something deep down had already warned us about it. Something this strange woman had just confirmed. We made our way back to our houses, trying to laugh off what the woman had said. After all, we knew the cow field well by this point. What could possibly be so dangerous about the barn? Rusty equipment? Maybe that's where they kept the bulls or something. But we heeded the warning, at least for the time being. Fall came and went, with a few visits into the cow field. The blackberries were all but gone. One of our last trips was particularly notable because of the sounds. Soon after, we had hopped over the gate and began our trek that led to where the cows idled in the cool air. We heard rattling. We all stopped in our tracks and listened closer. It was coming from the barn. It sounded like chains being shaken violently. Our imaginations ran wild. Was there a monster being kept in the barn? Maybe aliens? Whatever it was, it scared us enough to remember the woman's warning, stay away from the barn, and to get back to the safety of our houses as fast as we could. An especially cold winter kept us out of the pasture. Both the twins and I got Wii's for Christmas, and we were more than content to play Mario Kart together until it was warm enough to play outside again. As soon as the springtime rolled around, we were eager to get back out and see if the seasons had changed the landscape in any notable way. Our first trip back in this new year would be the last time I ever stepped foot in the cow field for the rest of my life. As soon as we arrived at the gate, we noticed the smell. It wasn't the regular, almost comforting smell of cow patties. It was far more putrid. It was as if the spring had unearthed this unholy stench from the bowels of the earth. We looked at each other in disgust, all of us fake retching and plugging our noses dramatically. As we walked further into the field, the smell became stronger and stronger. And that's when we realised the smell was coming from the barn. We remembered what the woman had said towards the end of last summer. Stay away from the barn. One of the twins started towards the dark, rotting structure so carefully concealed by trees. I stopped her and reminded her what we were all privately thinking. Stay away from the barn. She said that this was different. Didn't I want to solve this mystery? Didn't I want to know what was causing the ungodly smell? I didn't. She trudged on. Even her sister cried in protest. Stay away from the barn, she said. I muttered some words in agreement. She continued and disappeared into the grove. A minute of heavy silence crept by as the rustling of movement got farther away. We both stood and waited, soaking in the intensity and stench. A scream shattered the silence of the world where we were still children. We rushed in and found the other twin standing at the entrance to the door of the barn. We turned the corner and saw what made her scream in terror. A man sat hunched against the back corner of the barn. Gashes in the rotting side of the barn let sunlight in to illuminate his decaying corpse. His torso had been flayed to the bone, the ribs barely damming up his organs that had begun to spill through after the spring thaw. A dripping from the ceiling took our attention away from the dead man. We looked, in unison, up at a woman who was nailed to the crossbeam of the barn. Her headless body was completely naked, dripping fluid from open wounds from the place where her head used to be to her toes. I puked, then I ran. All three of us rushed to the safety of the twins' house. We ran inside and relayed the story to the twins' parents, through choked sobs and gasps of clean air. The police were called. My parents came next door and hugged me while I cried. After telling the story to the authorities, I don't remember much. I remember being given a sleep aid. I remember the police going to the nice woman's house. And I remember the police dogs barking all night. The days after were a confusing haze. The twins moved out only weeks later. I never said goodbye. Even seeing each other would be too much for all three of us. After that, we simply went our separate ways. I haven't seen them to this day, and it's probably for the best. The woman who owned the property had been using the barn as storage, not for hay or actual cattle, but the bodies of hikers that she had abducted from the surrounding trails. The two bodies we saw belonged to a couple who had been hiking the Appalachian Trail in the fall. The chains we heard all those months ago weren't attached to a monster as we had originally thought, but people. The monster lived in the house on the other side of the fence. The woman would often walk the AT in the surrounding area and strike up conversation, offering people a meal and a place to spend the night off trail. She would then drug their food and put them in the barn, gagged and chained, to be tortured and eventually killed. In total, the police found and identified 9 bodies, all missing persons last known to be on the Appalachian Trail. Some remains weren't able to be named, leading the police to believe that there could be as many as 13 victims, dating back as far as the early 2000s. I learned all of this long after, of course. What kind of parent would tell their child details about such a horrific series of events? I still live here with my parents. I still look out my window into the cow field sometimes. I try to remember the good memories I had out there with the twins. Pretending to be Harry Potter characters in the woods, collecting Mika we found in the creeks, touching the electric fences on dares. I hold a lot of regrets for someone as young as I am. I've tried to justify or get over as many as I can. But there's one that will haunt me forever, until my dying breath. What could have been if we stayed away from the barn? The Lavender Town Syndrome, also known as Lavender Town Tone or Lavender Town Suicides, was a peak in suicides and illness of children between the ages of 7 to 12, shortly after the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan back in 1996. Rumours say that these suicides and illness only occurred after the children playing the game reached Lavender Town, whose theme music had extremely high frequencies. Frequencies that studies showed only children and young teens could hear, since their ears are more sensitive. Due to the lavender tone, at least 200 children supposedly committed suicide, and many more developed illnesses and afflictions. The children who committed suicide usually did so by hanging or jumping from heights. Those who did not acted irrationally, complained of severe headaches after listening to Lavender Town's theme. Although Lavender Town now sounds differently depending on the game, this mass hysteria was caused by the first Pokemon game released. After the Lavender Tone incident, the programmers had fixed Lavender Town's theme music to be at a lower frequency, and ever since, children were no longer affected by it. One video appeared in 2010 using special software to analyze the audio of Lavender Town's music. When played, the software created images of the unknown near the end of the audio. This raised a controversy since obviously the unknown didn't appear until the Generation 2 games, Gold, Silver and Crystal. The unknown translate to "Leave now." There is also the said beta version of Lavender Town. It is said that the beta version of Pocket Monsters was released to some kids to test the games. The beta version of Lavender Town, the theme music, it's been playing in the background. I used to live in a very old house. It was very large, but very cheap, as many people were too creeped out by the way it made them feel when they visited the property. On the house tour, the realtor was feeling so bad he had to leave early and continue another day. Since I have 2 other siblings and we wanted our own rooms, it was the best home to go with. On the first day, all of the rooms were chosen by rock, paper, scissors, and, lucky me, I got the creepy attic. I myself love scary stories and often feel paranoid after staying up until 3 or so, reading scary stories on my phone. I love the thrill that would disrupt the normal day-to-day activities. Many days, when I was in the attic, I would hear the surrounding wood around me creak. Even when the smallest bit of wind blew, the house would cry. Sometimes, I would swear I could hear footsteps, but think, my mind must be playing tricks on me. The attic didn't even have a door for privacy. It was just straight up the staircase. In my sizable but mostly empty room, creepy closets all around that I sometimes swear would open on their own in the black of the night. But on one night, I know what happened was real. But who would ever believe me? I stayed up late, watching Creepypasta videos online until about 2 in the morning. And then, tired, I turned out all of the lights to attempt to sleep. The creaking throughout the old house kept me awake for a while. But soon, I started to notice that the creaking was different. It was the bottom step. My eyes were wide open, As I lay there motionless, I heard it creaking up even more. 2 steps this time. I laid there for a while as I heard it ascending the steps, taking more and more steps. All the while, my heart was jumping around in my chest. Finally, it stopped at the last step. I just couldn't bring myself to move at all. I was too petrified. My eyes closed faster than ever. My body lay dead as a log. Nothing. I peeked my eye slightly. Nothing. After a while of waiting and feeling it watch me, my curiosity got the best of me. So I opened my eyes to see the creature. Its ghastly grey skin, wide open, and large alien-like eyes, emotionless expression. Its long and spindly arms and legs on all fours. It sat there, unaware that I knew of its existence. My breathing was as even as I could get it, or else it might have known I was actually awake. After a while of just sitting there, it moved, fast, up my wall and onto the ceiling. I couldn't see it anymore. I sat there, waiting. I couldn't just go to sleep. And all of a sudden, in the darkness, I felt it. A cold finger on my cheek. I jumped in terror and sat up as it stared at me for half a second. Then it jumped down and screeched at me, chasing me down the steps as I desperately tried to get away from it. I finally got to my parents' room and proceeded to lock it behind me. Quickly went to shake them awake, and there was no response. I shook and shook. Nothing. I pulled the blankets off to see their insides splayed across the sheets. Blood soaked into the surrounding mattress. I froze in horror as it started banging at the door, each time more violent. Finally, I just blocked off the door and went into like a trance-like state. Next thing I remember is the police showing up, somehow making it through my barricade. Their horrified faces as they saw me, a 13-year-old kid with only skin and bones, and my parents, partially decomposed and stinking. I was sent to the mental hospital for the crime of killing my parents. At this point, I'm starting to believe maybe I did. Growing up, I had an imaginary friend, like most kids. I don't remember how he came into existence, but I remember him always being there. It was a shadow. More specifically, it was my shadow. It would whisper to me throughout the day. Even around 12 years old, it still hung around me, and most times would just stand beside me, vibrating, like it was struggling to keep its form. It had no name. It would just whisper, incoherently. I remember trying to have conversations with it. I would ask questions, but could never decipher what it whispered back to me. A few weeks before I entered high school, I started to understand parts of what it was saying. The more I ignored its requests, the more viciously it persisted. It begged me to kill something and would say anything to get its way. For a week, the whispers tormented me until I gave in. I found a toad in the front yard and did what it asked as it loomed over me. Once I'd finished, the shadow, though unimpressed, stopped whispering for a few days. It still followed me, but for that short time, I felt free. The first day of high school, I made a new friend, and he was just like me. I spotted him at the canteen. I could see that his shadow followed him, and it vibrated, just like mine. I went over and introduced myself. His name was Ben, and his shadow had been following him the same time as my own. After that, we hung out every lunch and would speak almost exclusively about what these things were. Ben told me that his shadow also whispered to him, but it was never malicious, and he was convinced it was a good force looking out for him. In fact, it had warned him about my shadow being dangerous. Of course, I knew my shadow wasn't inherently good. It had asked me to kill, but had been with me so long I felt a certain attachment to it. Since I'd met Ben, the shadow started to whisper more softly. It was like white noise. The only thing I knew for sure was it was saying the same thing over and over. This fact alone raised questions in my own mind. If Ben's shadow was good, then was it trying to silence mine from speaking to me? One Friday after school, Ben invited me to sleep over, and I agreed. That night, all we did was play Tekken on his new PlayStation, trying to unlock as many characters as we could in one night. All the while, my shadow continued to whisper the same inaudible words to me. I remember being happy that I finally had a real friend and was having fun at my first sleepover. I had a dream that night. There was a dark figure sat on top of me, watching me sleep. Streams of saliva fell from its face. The liquid covered my face and began to suffocate me. I felt the growing pressure of its weight on my chest. This was the moment my shadow started to whisper to me. And for the first time since I'd met Ben, I understood it.
Kill Ben. Kill Ben. Kill Ben. Kill Ben. Kill Ben.
The whisper repeated over and over again. I awoke, thrashing. The pressure on my chest was getting worse. I opened my eyes to find Ben sitting on top of me. The light from the lamp on the bedside table highlighted his facial features. He'd been crying. I heard a deep sob and felt a tear hit my face. "I'm sorry," Ben mumbled, lifting a kitchen knife above his head and bringing it down towards my neck. The whispers became screams, but it was two voices this time. Both of our shadows were screaming on either side of us, cheering for their side to kill the other. I grabbed Ben's hand before he buried the knife in my neck and edged my face away. His heart wasn't in the fight. In the corner of my eye, I saw the shadows slow dancing together as their screams continued. I used my other hand to push Ben off me and rolled on top of him. I pried the knife from his hand and buried it into his chest. He let out a soft whimper of defeat and went limp. I didn't stop. I wanted to, but I continued anyway. The screaming got louder with each strike, and silhouettes continued to dance on the walls in the background, their pace quickening with each strike. The screams hushed to whispers as I slowed down and stopped. They left me to the silence as I laid atop of Ben, the knife still in his chest. Panting and covered in his blood, I heard the door burst open and looked up to see Ben's mother. At that moment, the two dancing shadows slowed down and finished their performance. She pushed me off his body and screamed for her husband. I collapsed into the corner of the room. I hadn't taken my eyes off the shadows. They were beginning to fade, and in their final moments, bowed to the audience and shook each other's hands. The last whisper I heard before they disappeared was,
See, I told you he'd win.
The years I spent locked away with therapists, I learned to tell them what they wanted. But I know what happened. Now that I'm finally free, I'm going to find answers.